Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, joining you here on the live stream. That means we give you the opportunity to send your comments and questions while we're on the line with one of our media contributors and one of our originals here. Joining us tonight, Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama, to talk the Tide, talk the SEC in college football. Stephen, how you doing tonight?
Doing fine, man. Doing good. Technology's a crazy thing, but we gonna work with it.
So we will disclaim this. We usually like to see Stephen and his bright white smile. It lights up the screen. It lights up our broadcast. Unfortunately, tonight we will just have to hear those sultry baritone tones of Mr. Stephen M. Smith. We're having some technical difficulties, but audio is better than nothing. So we have chosen to go the phone route with Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama to talk Alabama football. All right, so before we get started, of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you love college football. If you love college football, got to subscribe and catch the discussion here. All right, Stephen, a lot of people were amused, or depending on your side of the narrative here with Central Florida, a bit disturbed by Nick Saban's comments concerning Central Florida. So let me read those real quick, and I'll get your take. He said, if you honor and respect the system that we have, despite some of the imperfections that you understand that the system has, then you wouldn't do something out of respect for the system that we have. I guess anybody has the prerogative to claim anything, but self-proclaimed is not the same as actually earning it. And there's probably a significant number of people who don't respect people who make self-proclaimed sorts of accolades for themselves. And then he also said, we have a system. It's not fair to the people who went through the system and earned their way playing really, really good teams. I mean, really good teams and really tough games. It's not quite fair to them for somebody else just to decide to claim a national championship. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, look at this, Mark. Of course, no offense at all to Central Florida. This team had a great season. Scott Frost, 2 or 3 years ago, this team was winless, 0-12, did not win a game. And to go from that to winning the conference, the American Athletic Conference, 13-0, and arguably have the biggest story to get drafted, that being Shaquem Griffin, with one hand showing the National Football League, I can ball, I can play, I can perform in this league, getting drafted by Seattle, a great run. A tremendous run by Central Florida. But when I looked at what Nick Saban said, and I understand, even down to Alabama, we seized an opportunity to play in the college football playoff. Alabama did not win its conference, but somehow, some way, got in, and we all know what happened at the end of the day. But when I looked at what his response made to Central Florida, I guess what Nick Saban is saying is you can't claim anything. Well, from Nick's perspective, the 5 championships he's gotten, he's won on the field. But let's be honest, prior to the BCS, a lot of people were claiming national championships. Even Alabama had claimed some. Now, of course, this did not come with Nick Saban's helm, but Alabama had claimed some due to back then the national champion was voted on after the end of the season. And you had various polls to quantify that or to make that claim. So it's a slippery slope. I personally have nothing against Central Florida. I felt like Scott Frost did an unbelievable job. We'll see what Josh Heupel does. But as far as what Nick Saban said, I can see why he said it. But at the same time, I mean, this is a Central Florida team that's trying to convince college football we deserve a seat at the big boy table. And every time you bring up Central Florida, it's making its point more relevant because it's continuing to be talked about.
We're on the line with Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama. Please join him also on his show, The Way It Is, Monday through Friday. What time are we talking on Fox 97.9? I've lost track of 2 to 4 Central Time.
Still 2 to 4 Central.
All right. Excellent. We enjoy watching Stephen talk. We're just going to have to enjoy this time of listening to him talk. We have some technical difficulties to work through, but we've got Steven right on the line, so we're going the old-fashioned route of the audio through the mic deal. I find this a fascinating argument because for me, Central Florida can do exactly what it is doing currently, especially considering the circumstances under which they won these games and who they beat and who beat the teams that they beat. So, for example, we've seen it a number of times before TCU made it into the Power Five, or Boise State, where they ran the table during the regular season. They beat some good teams, but nobody that we really thought, okay, this is an elite team, but they beat some good teams, one or two in the Power Five. Then they were ushered into a bowl game in which they played another really good team, but not an elite team. TCU beat a Wisconsin, for example, a team that was ranked in the top 10 in the Rose Bowl a few years back, but did not get the chance to play an elite team where you could line up the dominoes. You could make the transitive property and award something. Meaning that in this scenario, it just plays out perfectly for Central Florida to make the argument, of course, having beaten Auburn, the team that beat two #1 teams in the span of 3 weeks, Georgia and Alabama, and then the eventual national champion in Alabama, and the two teams that played in the championship game, to beat the team, the only team that beat them. It just lines up perfectly for Central Florida to not only say we went undefeated and we're in the group of 5 and we didn't get a chance and we deserve our chance, but to actually have knocked off the team that beat the two best teams. It just plays into the narrative perfectly for them to make the argument.
It does. And they're right now pushing for an opportunity to be at the table of college football saying, hey, we went undefeated. We won our conference. The team that won a national championship did not win the SEC. And I understand there was precedent before with Ohio State not beating Penn State and Ohio State not winning the conference title when they still went on to the college football playoff. But Central Florida, what they're conveying is, hey, we bring back a lot of talent. Yes, we lost Scott Frost to Nebraska, but we bring in Josh Heupel, who's an offensive mind. The majority of our pieces on offense come back. Watch us. I feel like next season, Mark, the Central Florida FAU game will be a very intriguing football game because you got Josh Heupel and Lane Kiffin, and you got two really good teams squaring off in Orlando, Florida. That will be the game. If UCF pulls this out against Lane Kiffin, who, yes, he's coaching UCF, but Lane Kiffin is highly regarded as one of the best offensive minds in the game to this point right here. And then he's also got the wonder kid in Charlie Weiss Jr. as the offensive coordinator. If UCF pulls this out against FAU, then I believe you will start to see a little bit more people jump onto the conversation of, hey, maybe we should look at Central Florida a bit more than what we're looking at.
Okay, I understand that line of thinking in terms of, okay, this being a flash in the pan versus maybe this is a program with some staying power, but I judge teams on their performance for that particular season. So particular viewers, fans that write me constantly make arguments about particular championships, and then they paint a broad stroke narrative of how good that program is and point to other years and other teams. I think you have to stay with that particular team. So either that Central Florida team has the right to claim a national championship, even if they walk on the field against Florida Atlantic and lose that game 50-0, that's a different team. So this is my logic in it. Different coaching staff, different head coach, different team. We need to judge and evaluate that team based on its merits. What happens from here on out? Sure, you can evaluate the staying power of the program, but in terms of the validation of that team, that doesn't do anything for me. So my question to you, Stephen, and we've got Stephen M. Smith of Touchdown Alabama on the line, and also his show Fox 97.9, The Way It Is. Stephen, if you're in Central Florida's shoes, do you take the same audacity to claim a national championship?
I would not. what I would do if I was Central Florida is I would find a way, and I know I would find a way to either schedule Alabama, or if I can't schedule in Alabama, I would schedule a number of teams in that Power Five, whether it's a Michigan, whether it's a Clemson. I would schedule somebody in that Power Five, make it a big game where the ESPN family of networks can watch me, and from that game, or a number of games I can schedule against Power Five schools, I would show the nation, look at me, I'm playing against a Power Five school. You didn't believe me at first. Now I'm playing against one. Watch me go out here and take care of business. If I was UCF, that'd be the move I would take. Whether I'm the president of the university or the chancellor or the athletic director, I would find a way to schedule one of these Power Five schools or multiple Power Five schools. Any chance I get to put myself on national TV against a program that other outlets consider elite, I would face that program, I would battle that program on the field, and I'll let it speak for itself.
So, Stephen, I'm in the minority here because based on what you just stated, I think that is a good tact to take for the perception of the program. You just finished off a season in which you beat Auburn, beat some other good teams, finished undefeated. You're making a claim. Yes, people want to see that backed up. So if you go out next season and you are able to schedule Oklahoma, Clemson, USC, fill in the blank, and win that game, or at least be extremely competitive, then people are going to perceive, okay, they beat Auburn that year. They lost their coach. They lost a lot of talent. They were still that competitive against that good a team, and they connect the dots because it's still the same program. It's still the same name brand. For me, again, I differentiate years and teams, and what they did in 2017 to me stands on its own, and I move on in terms of evaluating whether teams should claim titles. So for me, I was amused in a good way when I heard that Central Florida was taking this stand, because it was hours before that, Stephen. I was in a conversation and a number of people asked me, if you were Central Florida, what would you do about this? And I said, I'd put up a banner in the stadium, claim a national championship. I'd throw a parade. I pretty much said everything that they decided to do a few hours later. Well, of course, the plan was already in place, so I'm not taking credit for it, but I had the same mindset and thought process that I would say, hey, I'm playing major college football. My program did everything under its power to win all of its games and claim a championship. There's nothing else we could have done. If they would have lost a game and then beaten Auburn, great, you have a great season, you're a top 5 or 10 team. But no, we did everything we possibly could. The system just does not afford us the opportunity. Therefore, we're going to claim it. So before I continue with this, I want to give some exposure to the people on the chat line here. And somebody, NCIS Fanatic 21, states here something that you stated off the top, Stephen, in regards to Alabama and other programs. This is not just Alabama. Alabama gets picked on because they've got the most national championships, whether claimed or completely legitimate. So they get picked on for this. But this runs rampant through college football, of programs claiming championships that are a bit tainted either by multiple losses or by bowl losses. And Alabama's got a couple of those, specifically a 2-loss team in the early 40s, I believe 1941. NCIS Fanatic 21 makes mention of an Ohio State team, of course, in 2012 that would have been a great matchup against an Alabama, or most likely because Bama had the loss, Notre Dame. But that was Urban Meyer's first team that was on probation from the Jim Tressel Tattoo Gate scandal. And they went undefeated, but couldn't play in a national championship game. And then he cites an Ohio State team in 1996 that beat the #1 team in the country in the Rose Bowl, Arizona State. But because Florida had beaten Florida State convincingly, they were awarded the national championship. If we're going to pick those scenarios off, we could go through the entirety of college football for decades and tell you teams that had resumes where they could claim a national championship. Miami in 2002 because of the flag, not necessarily because of the win-loss record, because they lost the championship game to Ohio State. But Miami fans are extremely passionate, as you well know, Stephen, about the decision of throwing the flag late, and the Buckeyes went on to win in overtime. And I'll try to pick off.
Even Auburn marked in 2004.
Oh, absolutely. They played in arguably the best conference in college football and won all their games and had to go to the Sugar Bowl. And if you can still hear me, Steve, that was at a time in which Oklahoma and USC were the top two teams in the first poll, and Auburn was somewhere like 19th, and they played their way all the way up. And basically, they just hit a ceiling. And the way things were then, if you were 1-2 and you didn't lose, regardless of how impressive or not impressive, you just weren't going to get nudged out. And Auburn just hit a ceiling. And so Oklahoma and USC got to go play in the Orange Bowl for the national title, and Auburn was left out.
And that was an undefeated Auburn team with Jason Campbell at quarterback. So, I mean, the system has always been flawed in its own way. It's just crazy how before the BCS came in, you had a lot of the polls, as I mentioned, name the national champion or vote on the national champion after the season had ended. So you could have had a number of teams either undefeated or with one loss that were highly deserving, but you could have multiple national champions out there, but they would only pick one via the poll. I don't know how the polls were done back then. This was way before my time. It's just crazy how even in the evolution from polls to the BCS to the college football playoff, there's always that never-ending conversation. How does a team get in? What are you basing a lot of the merits off of? And I know the College Football Playoff Committee each and every year tries to make improvement on strength of schedule and resume and conference championships. And if you beat this team, that this team that you beat continues to keep winning to strengthen that schedule, that resume, and stuff on that number. But you always have that team or group of teams that get nubbed out, which is where UCF comes in. I mean, the American Athletic Conference is not a bad conference, but it's a conference that doesn't carry as much weight as maybe a Big Ten or an ACC or an SEC or a Big 12 or a Pac-12. So when I look at UCF, if they would schedule, and maybe not even this year, maybe a year down the road, if they would schedule a USC, or if they would schedule a team that's traditionally, nationally a powerhouse or multiple schools of that sort of statement and beat that team, or as you mentioned, play competitive with that team, then we can see UCF. I kind of equate it to Chris Peterson was always a good coach at Boise. Chris Peterson kept counting at Boise, whether it was Austin Pettis, Titus Young, Doug Martin, Kellen Moore, guys like Jarrett Simbransky, Ian Johnson. There was talent all over Boise State when Chris Peterson was there, and he kept having that team be the fly in the ointment, making it to bowl games, whether it was the Fiesta Bowl or different bowl games, high-ranking bowl games. But it was until Peterson made that move to Washington where people started to take him all the more serious as a coach, because he goes to a conference where it's Washington, it's a bigger name, it's a bigger brand, it's a bigger statement, it's a bigger market being in that Pac-12. So for UCF, am I saying should they leave the American Athletic Conference? Not necessarily. But do you start in the years down the road saying, we want to be taken seriously, we want to be named among the best in college football, let's schedule one of these teams that the media and that college football claims is the best. Let's go out there and either beat them or compete with them to where people look at us and say, this is not just little UCF, this is a team that we need to watch.
Ray LaRusso comments that the playoff system is corrupt and turning into a joke. People will start looking for another sport if this garbage continues. I don't know what he's exactly referring to. NCIS Fanatic 21 goes back in history, looked up the last time Alabama played Central Florida. That was in the year 2000, and according to NCIS Fanatic 21's research, Central Florida beat Alabama in 2040 to 38. I'll mention, Stephen, that maybe for your benefit and also the benefit of some viewers who are a little bit younger, what happened before 1998 in the BCS system, and actually before the Bowl Coalition that took place in 1992 in particular, what we did was watch bowl games on New Year's Day. And if you won the Big 12, you, at the time, the Big 8, you went to the Orange Bowl automatically, and they tried to find a actually not the best team to play you. They would go out and look for the best opponent for television ratings. So it might be Notre Dame, it might be somebody else. The Rose Bowl was locked in with the Big 10 and the Pac-12, the Pac-10 at the time, and before that, the Pac-8. The Cotton Bowl was locked in with the Southwest Conference, and of course, the SEC, as you well know, with the Sugar Bowl. And they all looked for opponents, and they looked for good opponents, but they weren't necessarily the best opponents to be playing. They were reaching for glamour teams, sometimes that were a little bit lower in the rankings. So we had situations in which, for example, one of the last undefeated teams that got hurt by the system was Penn State in 1994. They were undefeated, but because they were the number 1 or 2, depending on the poll, team in the country, they got locked in to a Big 10 Pac-12 matchup in which Oregon at the time in the Pac-10 was only like 20th in the country. They were 8-3. The two teams should not have been playing. So what happened was you had all these games on New Year's Day and New Year's night, and they were great games, but not necessarily the best matchups. And then we went to bed, Stephen, after watching the Orange Bowl and the Sugar Bowl that night, and we didn't know who won the national title. We had to wake up and get the newspaper and open it and look at the AP and the UPI, or later USA Today's top 25 coaches poll, and that told us who won the national championship. You didn't watch the game. You watched the games and thought, and everybody kind of surmised, maybe they got voted. I don't know. Miami just beat Nebraska 31-30. Are they going to vault them all the way from 5-1, as they famously did, of course, after the 2-point conversion in the 84 Orange Bowl? So you talk about a system that was crazy, was waiting for your morning newspaper to know who won the national championship.
At that time, Mark, coffee was highly valued.
And you can bet, knowing me, Stephen, you know that as soon as the last tick went off the clock of the Orange Bowl or the Sugar Bowl that night, I was making out my own top 20, and it wasn't a top 25 at the time. I'll let you know, it was a top 20. I was making out my own top 20, so I reigned my own national championship. So with all these schools running around claiming national championships, typically those are tied to the two major polls, the AP at the time, and first the UPI, and then USA Today took it over. But some of these polls, you know, Mark Rogers TV could have had a poll back in 1955, and if I said UCLA won the national championship, you would see it today with some of these listings of claim to national championship. Oh, they won the Mark Rogers TV national championship in 1955, and UCLA would tack that onto their list of national championships.
I could have had me a poll there. I could have me a poll there, Mark.
Oh, you can do whatever you want. Absolutely.
I mean, it's like I mentioned, you could have multiple national champions because there were a lot of votings going on. I know you mentioned the two major polls, but a lot of those guys were picking multiple national champions. You didn't quite know who to give it to.
Stephen, it was crazy. There was a time actually in which many of these so-called major polls would vote for the national champion before the bowl games. So, for example, in 1970, Ohio State was number 1 in a lot of polls, and they said they're the national champion. Then they went out to the Rose Bowl and lost to Jim Plunkett and Stanford, and they were still the national champion according to a bunch of polls. So it was nuts back then. Now we've got a playoff system that's not perfect. It doesn't involve all 5 major conferences, and anybody who's watched me knows that I rail on the playoff system all the time. But let's make one thing known here. Let's understand that it is the best system that we've had to date. It's still very flawed, but it's the best system we've had to date. We just saw most likely the 4 best teams in the country play the first week of January. Yes, Ohio State had a claim. USC had a little less of a claim, and Central Florida had a big claim. But most likely we saw the 4 best teams in the country, and most likely we saw the best 2 playing in that championship game between Alabama and Georgia.
And two playoff games, Mark, that went down to the wire. I mean, the playoff committee got their money's worth. The fans got their money's worth. And if you were watching it at home on TV, you definitely got your money's worth. Oklahoma and Georgia went to 2 or 3 overtimes before Sony Michel had the final touchdown there. It was he or Nick Chubb, one of the two, had the final touchdown run there. And, of course, for Alabama, the old 2nd and 26 with that Tua, Devontae Smith. Although Andy Papanastis from 36 yards, that was your hero moment, and just pushed it to the left. And that created the 2nd and 26 for Tua to Devontae Smith. But the question that's starting to spark up here, Mark, is with the playoff system now, has this diminished, bowl games in your mind?
Of course, it's diminished the bowl games. The playoffs get all the attention, even some of the major bowl games that we used to love seeing. Not for me personally, because I still enjoy all the bowl games and I enjoy them as the tiers go up. So, for example, to me, a Citrus Bowl that features LSU and Notre Dame, to me, that's an exciting game. There's 2 marquee programs, 2 brand names, and even though the winner, it's only going to affect the rankings, it's still just a tremendous football game and matchup for me. So it doesn't take anything away from me because I still love college football and I love seeing the big powers play, Ohio State, USC this past year in the Cotton Bowl. But I think for the general public, the periphery fan, it's just there is so much focus on the playoff system, and the other games are diminished. I don't think there's any question about that. Stephen M. Smith, Touchdown Alabama. Also catch him on his show, The Way It Is, Fox at 97.9, Monday through Friday, 2 to 4 Central Time. Stephen, we've got so much to talk about here, but I'm up against it with Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football to talk UCLA at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. So as soon as we can possibly get together, Stephen, I want to talk about this contract with Texas and USC for Alabama coming up in the next few years. I want to talk about the impact of Mike Slive on the SEC and college football, and I want to hear your latest on Alabama recruiting. So maybe we can get that scheduled soon, and we enjoy you jumping on board.
No problem, man. We'll get these technical difficulties squared away so I can be seen.
All right, Stephen. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.